Hello, my name is Garrick Wilhelm, and I am a professor of communication studies at San Francisco State University. Today, we're going to talk about the unlocking of the secrets of the functioning of discourse, based upon the teachings of Stuart Hall. So in the early part of the 20th century, traffic fatalities had become common. The automobile had gained popular use and had become the main mode of transportation for Americans, and fatalities were just seen as a natural outcome of vehicles having to share the roads with pedestrians and bicyclists, and it wasn't seen as a problem for most people. However, a group named Mothers Against Drunk Driving started to create rhetoric around drunk driving to make it illegal. And this advance resulted in laws that outlawed drunk driving. And the result of this was that people killed in drunk driving accidents was reduced by half. This shows the power of discourse in an ordered society. And though this is a success story, it's not the whole story. This rhetoric only served a certain group of people and left others unprotected. Now there are approximately 6,800 traffic fatality deaths caused by sober drivers every year, and 99% of them don't receive don't even receive a traffic ticket. So even if they acted in negligence, if someone were to end up killing someone without a vehicle, they would probably be charged with manslaughter or negligent homicide, and we would prosecute them and put them in jail. But when it's a vehicle, we seem to have no problem with it. So this is the product of discourse, and the product of discourse is evaluated not just on the desired outcome, but on the entire influence of the use of rhetoric of discourse. So at the beginning of the semester, we defined discourse as the conversation, language, and norms that exist around a particular topic. The discourse surrounding a topic determines what can be said about that topic and by whom. And more informally, discourse refers to the process of knowledge formation via communication. Today, we will unlock the secrets of how discourse functions to create not just knowledge, but our entire understanding of our experience of reality. So, our first thoughts as human beings reflect upon the reality that we're experiencing, followed by an understanding of our place within that reality, within that world. This creates existential questions that we need to answer in order to understand who we are and what our place is. We ask, who am I? But when we ask, who am I? We're also asking who I am not, and start noticing a difference. Start to make meaning of the differences that we see between who am I and who are other people. When we evaluate our purpose by asking, why am I here? We are evaluating our place in the world and carving out a meaningful place for us to create action in the world. We naturally want our action to complement the actions of others and to counter the actions of certain others. When we ask, what is my value? We're trying to evaluate our place in a community where we see inequality and difference, and we begin to compare our value to others. And in some cases, even diminish the value of others in order to create more meaning for our own value. Because these processes are so ingrained in our identity, they seem natural. It appears as though if these questions weren't answered, these processes didn't exist, we wouldn't seem to exist. Therefore, the process seems essential to our being. Ultimately, though, these are really just stories that we're telling ourselves, that we created and believe, and which evolve over time, and that we reenact on an ongoing basis. So I'd like you to take a look at this picture for a moment and think to yourself who this man may be. Just from looking at the picture, look at the characteristics of the picture, of the clothes he's wearing, of the scene he's standing in, the facial expressions. Can you ascertain something about this man, about who he might be? Just as an experiment, tell yourself a story about this man. So now that you have a story in your head, you've created a reality about him. That is now your truth. And if I were to show you this picture months from now, you would recall the story that you created and relate it back to the man in this picture as you remember the reality that you created around him. Now, what if I told you that this represents a man from a newspaper article that talks about how he had been working in his yard and stopped by the bank in his pickup to pick up change from the bank. And when the bank wouldn't validate his parking, he responded by removing the $7 million in deposits that he had with the bank. That's a little different story. So now hearing this different story, who is this man to you now? Maybe your understanding is a little different. Maybe you might see my story as being more credible. Maybe I'm speaking from a place of authority. I presented the picture. Maybe I know more about it. Maybe the details in the story make it seem more interesting and believable. Regardless, this story is now your new reality. Now, when we look at the story that we now believe, we can look at how we'll extend this story now to other old men in overalls. You may happen upon an old man in overalls and wonder whether he has $7 million in bank. We hardly stop to think, though, about the stories that we believe. And because we don't see it in the world, we don't ask whose story isn't heard. Maybe someone had a different story about this man, but we didn't give them the opportunity to be heard. And I, from a position of power, give you a believable story that you believe because I'm in a position of authority and I'm giving you this information and presenting it along with the picture. So when we don't ask this about the stories that we are hid, we don't have the opportunity to see things differently. Now you might ask, but what's the real story? This man must really exist somewhere. Can't we ask him who he is? Well, this picture actually came from a website that gave instructions on how to wash bib overalls. And the photograph is not credited. It probably came from stock photography and is certainly edited for this presentation. I doubt that he was standing in front of clouds like this, and that we can likely never know who he is. And therefore, this story ends up being not being just a part of the original story. Ends up not being a part of a reality. Only the stories that we've told and believed. So as we look at the way that communication relates to and interacts with our reality, this reality that we've talked about this gentleman in the overalls, there are three positions from which we can evaluate these processes. So the first position is pre-discursive. It's the realist position. It says all that exists is real and has inherent meaning that we, through communication, discover and describe. So the process of discovery of what's out there. The second position is post-discursive. It's kind of the opposite. It's textual position, and it says nothing actually is real. It may exist, but it's not real until we label it, describe it, give it meaning, create value. And so through communication, we create our reality by giving meaning to the things that we find that are existing. So a discursive position isn't a middle ground or even a combination of the two. It's really a complication of the two. And this is a reflexive position. So it says all that exists in reality is present, and it may have certain uses. It may be helpful for certain things, but that it is given value through communication. However, because it's a communication process, its meaning is changeable and is continually recreated as it is communicated again. And what we find value in communicating is replicated and becomes more present in our reality. So this is the idea that we're not just taking a wild landscape and describing it, or we're not taking a wild landscape and giving it meaning. It's more like we've created a garden. We create not just our understanding of our reality, but even the physical reality. Because we give meaning and value to certain things, we then create them within the environment that we're describing. So one of these positions is not particularly more right than the other. They're just three different ways of looking at the relationship between communication and the physical world. But in order to unlock the secrets of discourse, we're going to adopt the third discursive position. So let's just work from that framework for the time being. So in discourse, we want to start to create order out of this reality that we've created. We want to start to shape it and turn it into something that is manageable and ordered, that we can predict the outcomes. So these are three cultural systems that work to create our urban society. The first one is religion. So religion sought to create order by recognizing a difference between people, labeling some people as moral and other people as immoral, that this idea of morality or immorality came from an ultimate authority we call God, and that this is enacted within a hierarchy of someone who has power that obscures it as a system, because we can't access that ultimate authority and we have to believe people that we've given power. It doesn't appear questionable. Now, this isn't not just only that difference is created between people. It also creates a hierarchy of power that gives power to some power to more other people that they claim is enacted on behalf of God. So we can't really create an idea of difference without creating systems that reinforce that difference in society, in these ordered systems. The second cultural system is government. So government is a system of order that tries to protect good people from bad people through enforcement and punishment. We place a responsibility upon people in the government to do this enforcement and punishment and to serve our needs. So we elect representatives that act on our behalf. And so this system becomes obscured by the idea that we're the government and everything that it does is for us. So we are actually the ones doing it. And this kind of makes it appear as though it's not questionable or that it's natural and that we all participated, so it must be what we want. The third ordered system or cultural system is science. Now you're saying, but science is science, right? It's evidence provable, it's hard, fast, it is what the truth is. And to some degree, that's true. I'm not challenging that. But science also works as a cultural system. And through this cultural system, it tries to create difference through scientific inquiry. This means that those who are making the inquiry get to decide what to inquire about, and usually do it to try to prove the differences that they believe already in our society. Because their scientific inquiry produces evidence, that evidence has to be accepted by the greatest number of people, or it's not considered truth. And so really, it's just serving a majority of people or a greater number of people. And its system is obscured by the idea that this discovery can be duplicated and therefore is outside of human intervention. But in all reality, we believed at one time that the sun revolved around the earth. And we had evidence created by discovery and scientific inquiry that could be duplicated and that was accepted by the greatest number of people. The same with the earth being flat. And particularly as we're talking about discourse, The same also with race. Scientists proved that there were skull sizes and other physical attributes or even genetic differences that created race, and that those differences then could explain differences in behavior and start to value people differently. But as we know, scientific inquiry is never complete and it always evolves. So we often look at other understandings that we no longer believe as being more primitive or less enlightened, but the truth is what we believe now will be viewed upon by future generations as unenlightened and primitive. And so we can't really ever believe that science gives us a complete understanding of everything there is to know. It's just the most complete that we have right now. So these ordered systems are not created by accident. They're not a natural process. When we start to create difference in the world, some people end up having more power. And the more power that someone has, the more ability that they have to change the systems to benefit themselves. They get to choose what we inquire about. They get to influence what we see as moral and how we enforce good and bad. And so their influence becomes important. The more these systems start to benefit some people, they also benefit other people less. And that creates inequality in these ordered systems. And it creates the opportunity for powerful people to hide that inequality within and appear as a natural part of these cultural systems. That we have to have power and inequality in order to have this ordered society. Now, the catch is that as we operate in these systems, we give our acceptance to these cultural systems, and we therefore accept the power of others. And we continue to recreate those systems through our participation in them. So it may seem like these systems are natural or that they are outside of question, but it only seems that it works naturally because of the way discourse works. It seems as if, though, we can't find a person to blame or a reason that this is happening, that there's no real way to undo it. And so it appears natural. It really isn't our reality until we accept the role that we play in discourse. And once we understand the role that we play, we can start to recognize the change that can come from our own thinking. So an example of this change, I'll use the city of San Francisco, wherever you reside. So as late as 1964, San Francisco was seen as a potential Republican stronghold. Back in the 50s, the voter registration in San Francisco was about equal between Democrats and Republicans. There were elected Republicans in San Francisco. The very first Republican convention away from the East Coast was held in San Francisco in 1956. And this was repeated again in 1964 at the Cow Palace in San Francisco because it believed that this would bring about a red wave in San Francisco, and capturing San Francisco for Republicans would bring this influence to capturing California for Republicans. However, the Vietnam War brought subversive voices into this crux and started to create a different outcome. So from the Vietnam War, we got the free speech movement at Berkeley and San Francisco State, where students were suddenly able to start speaking about political issues on college campuses. Previous to that, political speech wasn't allowed. And part of the evidence of that is the very first free speech platform that was built on a college campus right here at San Francisco State University. This was followed by other groups in the Summer of Love in 1967, where people in response to the Vietnam War and to rising flower children, the children of the baby boomers, really started to imagine a more peaceful world, a more loving world, a different way of seeing society that didn't include war and the oppressive systems that they saw. And they started really bring into the public imagining a different kind of world. And this really inspired the civil rights movement and, to a more direct degree, the student strikes of 1968 at San Francisco State and Berkeley. And these students were pushing back against a Eurocentric education, or education they saw that didn't reflect themselves, and where they had even created the very first Black Studies curriculum, wanted to have the same standing as all other curriculum in the university. So students at San Francisco State shut down the campus for nearly a year until their demands were met. And so the very first ethnic studies programs were created at Berkeley and San Francisco State. And even today, San Francisco State has the only college of ethnic studies in the world. This really started to cause shifts in the curriculum at San Francisco State, to where social justice became a major focus of education, where progressive ideas started to work its way into all areas of education, educational curriculum, and where we now have upper division coursework in global perspectives, social justice, environmental sustainability, and American ethnic and racial minorities. This resulted in the 30,000 students at San Francisco State and the 40,000 students at Berkeley learning a very different way of understanding the world, a very progressive idea about what society could be, and really understanding some of these ideas behind what we're talking about in discourse. And so you can imagine what 70,000 students in the San Francisco Bay Area learning about these things and regularly going out and talking about them. And this really created a very different kind of San Francisco, a place where now San Francisco is considered a slur by Republicans because of its progressiveness. And often progressiveness see the Democratic Party as neoliberal and too far to the right for their tastes. So this is an idea of how rhetoric and discourse changes over time. It seems when we say something, the world doesn't change, so we don't believe that we can change the world by what we say. But if we look at the building of ideas and the transfer of ideas between people and groups over time, that can mean major changes in the way that we see society and the way that it operates. So there are some important ideas in the operation of discourse that I'd like to cover. And I'll admit that these definitions are a little self-serving. They're not dictionary definitions, but they do help to highlight the way that discourse works in an ordered society. So the first definition is power, and I really love this definition. It's the ability to define reality for another and have them accept it as their own. So if we go back to the cultural system of religion, religion starts to define a reality for us, a set of beliefs that we accept, and we make them our own beliefs. And so power works in this way to create a reality that is not really our own, but that we accept as our own because of the influence of that power. Rhetoric is the use of communication to form attitudes or to induce action in others with the goal of changing attitudes and behavior. So this is really power operating in the form of communication. It is who is believed and how they have the opportunity to influence others to different attitudes and behaviors. Grouping some of this rhetoric, we can create ideology. And ideology is the production of what makes sense, we might call this common sense, and what things mean. These ideas, values, and beliefs determine the manner in which they are lived out in the lives of individuals. And so if we look at political ideologies, they produce what we think makes common sense. If I'm a Republican, it seems like the economy is most important. If we provide for businesses, they'll create jobs. We'll have a robust economy where people thrive and are able to gain wealth. And that ideology means that I live out those by acting in favor of Republican candidates and voting Republican. And that makes sense to me as I accept the ideology of republicanism. And it seems that other ideologies that oppose it are the opposite of what makes sense to me. They don't make sense. So Republicans often can't understand the way that Democrats think. It doesn't make sense to them. They don't find the same meaning. And this really comes from the values and beliefs that are inherent in an ideology. A dominant ideology really is a hegemony. So these are accepted cultural norms that cause dominated groups to see dominated attitudes, values, and cultural practices as common sense. So this is where ideology becomes a power structure, where we, in a position of being dominated, have to accept the ideologies of the dominant group, that their practices make more sense. And so we look at the dominant ideology of the American dream and how there is social mobility within American systems that if you just work hard enough, you can make it. But dominated groups often find it hard to find social mobility within the American dream. They've just accepted this cultural norm of the American dream as a dominant attitude that really reinforces the ability of those who are dominant, not those who are being dominated. So even though this makes common sense, it really doesn't serve dominated groups. It really serves dominant groups. The next idea is culture. Culture is the practices, ideologies, and values that a social group uses to make sense of and embody their given condition and circumstances. It is inextricably linked to power. Well, you might say, oh, culture is my own. Culture are the ways I practice how I see my place in society. It's my practices, ideologies, and values in the groups that I belong to. And they're what embody and give meaning to my condition, my circumstances in society. But if we look back at power, in a lot of ways, our position in society is a reality that's defined for us. We're just trying to give meaning to that place that we've been given. And so then we grasp onto these very tangible representations of our place within society, call them our own, and become proud of them, and that we own this culture. And it is in many ways our own. We're making sense of our condition and circumstances within society. But it really is tied to that place, that condition and circumstances in society are defined for us, not necessarily ones that we've chosen. We just choose how to put this into practice. Another important idea is institutions. Institutions are accepted, desirable, and repeating patterns of behavior, evidenced by roles, traditions, rituals, and norms that create a system with a cohesive identity. So I look at the institution of marriage. It creates a very ordered society. We buy into the institution of marriage. We believe that we need to find a partner of the opposite gender, that we need to create families and bring up children within these family structures, and that this institution of marriage creates the institution of the family, and that by continually repeating these behaviors, even the rituals that are tied to this institution, this cohesive identity creates something that we buy into, that we're able to accept as a whole, and that we will continue to enact by participating in it. We can then extend these to the idea of the criminal justice system as an institution, where it becomes a pattern of behaviors that are created through traditions and rituals and norms that the criminal justice system reenacts through these rituals, the rituals of the courtroom, of trials, of policing, of incarcerating people. And that cohesive identity gives meaning or provides a structure to it that we accept as a whole. It gives it a cohesive identity. The last idea I'd like to share with you is class. So class is a person's relationship to economic, social, or political standing that govern life within a social order. It is an inequality in comparative groups that causes conflict that makes it appear as though it's natural. So class happens from the inequality that we create when we're creating difference. And This creates strata or groups of people that we put into classes. In many ways, they can even be turned into castes. And we start to accept that inequality is an inherent part of the system. Because of the conflict between us, I own my place in the class that I'm in, and I start to fight for what I think I should have within that class. So these are important ideas in the ways that discourse operates. So if discourse is both a reflection of the world we see and a recreation of that world through our own perspective, it becomes critical that we place ourselves as critical thinkers, understanding that faulty logic is used to define these systems and that we can influence those around us to think differently. That we have a participation in discourse that we must own and take a part of. Now, you as students have a unique position in the changing of discourse because you have the opportunity to be both learners and producers of knowledge. Very few people get the opportunity to spend the bulk of their time learning about the ideas and how they operate in our society and how we can change them from a certain perspective. And you also have the opportunity then to take that learning out into the world and to share it with others and help them to see the world a little bit differently. So the way that the discourse really happens, it comes down to our own thinking. How do we change discourse? We change our own thinking. It changes our thoughts, our discourse, our behaviors. And as we start to influence others and to build coalitions with other people who think alike, we can start to change ordered society to be more within our perspective and to serve more people greater. I hope you've learned a lot about discourse and the secrets of how it functions. And I thank you for your time today.